Lewis, who advocates for a Scotland where everyone's creativity, curiosity, and well-being are fundamentally valued. He directs the Ceilidh, an independent organization linking communities, education, research, and culture across Scotland and beyond. He consults on public and community engagement programs, both nationally and internationally. He is an organizing member of the Anti-Racist Educator Collective and the Equity at Excite community of practice. He is also an UK Creative Community Fellow with NAS and currently working with the British Science Association on the Ideas Fund, supporting communities to lead public engagement around mental well-being. And with that, I invite Lewis. The stage is all yours.
Thanks very much, and really great to be here, and I really enjoyed listening to Abraham and Alga's talk, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of common threads. In fact, I know there is definitely, so we'll pick that up. I am just going to share my slides, and I've set a wee timer. So the theme of our talk, I'm based here in Edinburgh in Scotland, is around how we support equitable community science engagement through traditional arts in particular. And by traditional arts, we're talking about folk music, folk dance, as one of our main mediums of how we support these relationships and how we support this kind of process of building connections. And I'll be sharing some resources about how you can actually take some of the principles and some of the formats that we do and potentially apply them in your own work. Because of course, the great thing about culture and arts in general is that every culture has traditional music and traditional arts and a way of bringing people together. And that's very much the spirit of what we try to do. And very briefly, my background is originally in neuroscience research. That's how I began working in public engagement. So I've been working in informal science learning. So with science festivals, for example, since 2009. So for a long time, whilst I was studying, and then I was interested in how I could communicate research around neuroscience, around health and well-being in particular. I'm hoping that my slides are working, by the way. Do give me a shout if that's not the case. And through this process, what was interesting, and so we started to work a bit internationally. We did work with the Abu Dhabi Science Festival. We worked with the Bangalore Science Festival, my early interaction with India, so great to be here virtually again, is to explore how, with science festivals in the UK and in Scotland in particular, there was a real issue that we were really preaching to the converted. Generally speaking, the groups and families that we were seeing are people who already have what we might now call higher science capital. And so they come from more privileged backgrounds. They come from parents who have science backgrounds as well. And we were really interested in how I was really interested in how we could actually open up and break these silos and work. Because ultimately, if we're only working for those who are converted, we're actually widening the gap and actually not solving inequity issues at all. Alongside that, I play traditional music. You can see the violin or the fiddle in the background. So I play traditional Scottish music, and we had a professional Ceilidh band. And what's really nice about traditional Scottish dance is that it's something we learn at school, something we do at celebrations, and it's not about your ability to dance. It's about the spirit of bringing people together and just joining in. And I was really interested in how we could take that model, how we could take that spirit and bring it into science engagement. How can we make sure that everyone feels invited? They don't need to be an expert. They don't need, well, everyone has a different level of expertise. Even an expert is not an expert in anyone else's life apart from their own. And so how do we make sure that everyone feels like they are able to share, to benefit, to ask questions about science as a way of developing, exploring the world around them and making sense of what they find meaningful. And then alongside that, we were interested in working with schools as one of the ways that we could support this wider, and working very closely with researchers, including with cancer researchers in the last image. A little bit about the organisation. I set the organisation up in 2016, so we're a relatively young organisation, but Science Ceilidh works all across Scotland. We support all different types of learning, particularly in schools, but also what we call community learning and development. So youth work programmes. I'm working with libraries. I'm working with different types of community groups. And I'll give some examples of that a little bit later. We are very much interdisciplinary, so a lot of our programs are around science engagement, but many of our programs are focused particularly on culture for its own intrinsic value. And we also have a lot of programs focusing particularly on mental well-being in particular. And of course, though I'm not in research myself now, very much as a practitioner, we work very closely with researchers and institutions and very much act as an independent bridge. So we're not an academic organization. We're kind of in between that community organization. We speak both languages, which means that we can help navigate and work with what communities are interested in. If they want to do a science project, that's great. If they want to do a cultural project, that's also great. And we can match them. We don't have the same confines as an academic institution, perhaps. And very quickly, our kind of theory of change, what we'd like to see in the future is essentially, like in the introduction, a Scotland where everyone feels like they can be creative, they can be curious, they can be well, and that their own skills and interests are actually fundamentally important, and that they can use that to support their communities and to change it for the better. And a lot of our work is doing that on the ground, but also a lot of it's strategic. So how do we support the sectors to connect together, those in culture, those in STEM, those in research, and those in what we call the third sector, which is charities, NGOs, that type of thing. So we can all work together and connect the dots. Okay, so how do we do that? How do we use culture? And for those of you who've never been to a Ceilidh yet, as I said, the spirit of a Ceilidh is everyone can participate. It's something that's very participatory. It's about joining in. The original meaning of the word Ceilidh, so in Scots Gaelic, one of the languages here in Scotland, it's actually to do with a gathering. So though some of our work is about dance, and that's certainly how we began our program, and I'll show you some examples of that, most of our work now is much more about that broader spirit as opposed to literally using dance. But it's about a community gathering. And again, every culture has that. And certainly I know in India, traditional music and traditional dance is incredibly important, but there are many other ways that people come together. To give you an example, so at the very early stages, what I call phase one of Science Ceilidh is much more about the science arts angle. This is one of our first projects funded by Wellcome. And it was about how we can connect community groups across Scotland with researchers, particularly around biomedical sciences, particularly around chemistry. And we would write these new dances based on the traditional dances that we had in Scotland. And then we would almost develop these kind of high level ones, which are a little bit more advanced than what we would do in person, but they matched the curriculum better. So they were learning tools for students. And so I won't show the whole video. And in fact, I'm just going to triple check that I'm sharing music, because if not, that will not work. And you can see us in the background. You can see some of the dancers we were working with. This is called the leaf, about photosynthesis.
To start with, light hits the chlorophyll molecules inside something called photosystem 2 and starts exciting the electrons. The excited electrons are then passed down a series of molecules called an electron transport chain. Energy is lost from the electrons as they go, and this is stored by changing ADP into ATP. The electrons then pass to photosystem 1, which reacts to a different wavelength of light. This re-excites the electrons, and they're passed along another electron transport chain by changing ADP into ATP. Next, they join a molecule which also helps store energy called NADP+. Water, or H2O, enters the equation and reacts with the newly energized NADP+. The NADP+ takes the H+, or protons, from H2O, becoming NADPH and releasing oxygen and 2 electrons. These electrons are then recycled to begin the whole process again.
So I'll pause that there. Hopefully that doesn't trigger too many negative memories about your high school biology, perhaps. But you can see in these cases, these are more complicated than what we would do in person. But the idea is that we develop these models collaboratively, and then the resources would have a teacher toolkit, they'd have lesson plans, and they'd have an interview with the researcher sharing how the research is linked to this kind of core science, as it were. And if you're interested in any of those, we've got many of these dancers on our websites. They're all freely available, and be very interested to see them being used. But through that process, we actually found in our phase 2 approach that it was not just about developing dancers to kind of explore science and teach science in that kind of instructional sense, but actually the process of writing these dances in of itself was really beneficial. And this is when we started focusing on our school program much more about what we call embodied learning. And so how can we use movement as a tool to actually, and creativity and culture as a way of actually embedding and supporting groups, young people, to take ownership of the science and to develop these science models that they can then actually explore, touch, critique, and share with their families. So again, this is a resource, and a lot of our work now is focused on how we support teachers, how we support youth workers to apply something like this if they're not confident in the science, or they're not confident in the arts and the expressive arts elements. And actually, I want to show you one of the dances that was created by the young people themselves. So all the moves are developed, and this is about how we see.
Off you go! What enters the eye? Cells in the eye get excited. And the message goes through the octagon. And it stops over. And again. To the back of the brain. And we can see. Give a massive round of applause.
Can we just make sure everyone is on mute, if that's okay? I think someone might not be. Brilliant. So hopefully that gives you a sense. I mean, we've got lots of different versions of this type of dance. Some of them are very short, so we've tried to design it so teachers can actually do this as a short kind of revision activity, as it were, to kind of consolidate the learning that learners have. But sometimes these are whole school projects, and we work with a school maybe for a term, or they would work for 4 or 5 sessions, and they would develop something much more intricate, and they can play with these science models in lots of different ways. And again, what we're trying to do is develop the tools. We're not saying that we've invented this. There's a lot of evidence about the benefits of embodied learning and using arts and creativity within a learning setting that actually benefits and makes learning better. But we're trying to provide those tools and formats that make it easy for teachers, educators to actually apply into their own work, and to make it as accessible as possible. Whoop. And I guess a lot of the rationale behind this and what we're trying to really capture in our action research is about how this can, it's about celebrating the value of arts and culture in of itself. And that's something that a lot of schools find really difficult to fit into the curriculum and to try and give that a proper place. Secondly, it's about providing opportunities to challenge stereotypes about science, that science is creative and it is a process, and provides that space for role modeling the fact that, you know, a lot of scientists will have art skills, and vice versa. A lot of artists and creatives have to go through a process where they have to really think about concepts and really formulate different ideas. A lot of it for our work is about trying to encourage everyone to think that science and creativity is a key skill for everybody. And then a final part of it, apart from the learning objectives, so things like we encourage young people, it's developing higher order thinking skills. So it's about young people taking what they know and thinking about it in a very different type of way, working as a team, critiquing it. And that's a really important part of the process. All science models have flaws, and we can use this to kind of explore the basics, and then you can almost use that as a framework, and use that as a kind of foundation to then say, well, okay, let's say if we had a model of the water cycle, this is one of our resources, for example, what happens with climate change? What happens if the temperature increases? What's going to happen with the evaporation? How could you represent that in your dance model? And letting people develop that. And then finally, in most of our programs, it's all about trying to encourage young people to take ownership. So they've created the dance, they can share it, they can share how they've done it, they can teach everyone what each of the steps are. And what's really important there is that they can then share that in a community event, or they might do an assembly for the school where they can invite the families along. And one of the important reasons why that, and why so many of our programs involve the whole families as much as possible, is because there's lots of research about how yes, it's important to change young people's mindsets, but it's also about involving the peers and their families, because ultimately it's the family stereotypes about science that's going to have quite a big influence on how what they support their young people to do. So if we have young girls for physics, for example, we can change their minds, but it's about how do we encourage their parents to also agree that actually, physics for them is relevant to their lives as well. And just one quick example I want to share about that very recently is around we recently had COP26. We were working with some Glasgow schools and East End in a kind of more classically often ignored, let's say, part of Glasgow, and we were working with the young people to develop a whole series of understanding how climate change is not just going to happen globally, but is going to affect them and their community and what they found important. And we managed to, even with COVID, safely organize a big community event where they brought their families along. Most of the families have never, in fact, in our evaluation, none of them had gone to a climate change event beforehand. And actually, through the process of these young people sharing what's going to happen through movements, through this big kind of shiny event where we had kind of cycle-powered lights, for example, and they shared all the images that they made of what they would like to do in their local communities to help mitigate climate change and reduce the impact on climate change. Again, in our evaluation, it's just a lot of the families actually, it was the first time that they really had a chance to really properly think about what climate change is going to do in their community. And we're just finishing off our evaluation for that. That'll be soon on our website as well. So I'm just going to draw out a couple of principles, I think. Hopefully that gives you a bit of an example of what we do. But some of the principles, I think, is firstly, communities is not hard to reach, but they're easy to ignore. And I think one of our tools that we do, especially when we're working across Scotland in rural communities, is that traditional music and dance and culture are one of the ways that we can build a relationship first. And that's really fundamental. Like, I think if you come in just with the research hat, I think that turns potentially the majority of people off. And so for us, it's about how can arts and culture be a shared language to build a relationship, build trust, to build learning expertise. They will have local songs and language, Gaelic, for example, where we could learn, and importantly, we could share music from other parts of Scotland, for example. And so some of the images here are from Shetland, on the north coast of Scotland, or the Western Isles, and where we're working in care homes, particularly around health and wellbeing and music. And the other quick example I'm going to share, I know I'm running out of time, is thinking about how we can use this from a context with refugees, for example. So our new Scots, as we call them here in Scotland, and we've had a long-term partnership, 4 or 5 years now at this point, working with multicultural family base, and a lot of that was working and supporting cultural exchange. So some of the people that we work with are Syrians, are from the Kurdish community, where they have their own traditional dances that they would like to share, and they would like to learn Scottish dances, for example. And through that process over many years, actually building trust and relationships actually enabled us to realize that actually what they would want to do is, many of the men, for example, come from engineering backgrounds, and a lot of the young people were really keen to explore engineering and STEM and play. And so we could actually develop these kind of new projects, more conventional public engagement projects, off the back of this cultural exchange. And again, for me at this stage, it's not using dance to explain science, but it's using culture as a way of actually learning and learning from each other. That builds trust, and through that actually can develop more meaningful programs where you genuinely find out what communities want, and they won't necessarily tell you that unless they trust you. I'll quickly share this video.
We'll do some science, Ceilidh, and we'll do some activity, and I like macaroni and cheese, and I love Scotland.
So even for our science engagement events, we would do a Ceilidh at the very end, and this is one of our young people who's worked, and it just to translate that, it's a little bit difficult to hear with everything, is for the Refugee Festival. He said he did science Ceilidh, he did activities, he loves cream cheese, and he loves Scotland, which I think sums up perhaps some of the things that we get to do. And then just to round off, what happens when the project ends? How do we build in this long-term capacity? And again, for us, it's about learning, sharing our learning as much as we can. All our resources are free, and they're designed for practitioners to be able to implement our work and learn from our work. And a lot of our work is also about building networks now. So again, a lot of our work is starting to think about networks. And one of the campaigns that I might encourage you to think about is the Fun Palace campaign, which is all about the first weekend of October. It's a worldwide campaign. Anyone who It's about celebrating the arts, sciences, and skills that communities have. And it's a global campaign. It's a global weekend of action where any communities, as long as it's free, it's meaningful to communities, can get involved. And so this is one way that we shout about and have a global reach. We also support different networks across Scotland, and we're starting to fund fund communities to develop these types of projects, to actually take the lead themselves and work with researchers, but very much centre the communities themselves. So I'm going to wrap up there. There's going to be a bit of time for panel, hopefully, but I want to say a massive Benyavad, thank you, or Tapalaith in Scots Gaelic. We do have lots of resources on our website. You can connect with us, and you can.
Thank you, Lewis. Wonderful session, and how I wish I was at a Ceilidh session now, dancing to science.